or biopolitical production to emerge in the hegemonic position, which industry used to hold, has all kinds of immediate implications for gender divisions of labor and various international and other geographical divisions of labor. That's something I want to set aside for tonight, but I'd love to talk about it, but I feel like I need to go in another direction. So I want to come back to Marx. So if we focus on the new struggle between two forms of property implied by this transition, that allows me to return to Marx's formulation. Whereas in Marx's time, the struggle was between immobile property, such as land, and movable property, such as material commodities. Today, the struggle is between material property and immaterial property. Or to put it another way, whereas Marx focused on the mobility of property, today at issue is centrally scarcity and reproducibility, such that the struggle can be posed as being between exclusive versus shared property. The contemporary focus on immaterial and reproducible property in the capitalist economy could be recognized like from a different perspective. This seems to be a quick and, for me, convincing notion, by looking at the field of property law. Patents, copyright, indigenous knowledges, genetic codes, the information in the germplasm of seeds, and similar issues are the most actively debated topics in the field of property law. And the fact that the logic of scarcity doesn't hold in this domain poses new problems for property. Just as Marx saw that movement necessarily triumphs over immobility, so too one might say that the immaterial triumphs over the material, or maybe better, the reproducible over the unreproducible, the shared over the exclusive. Okay. The emerging dominance of this form of property is significant in part because it demonstrates and returns to center stage the conflict between the common and property as such. Ideas, images, knowledges, code, languages, even affects can be privatized and controlled as property, but it's more difficult to police ownership because they're so easily shared or reproduced. There's a constant pressure for such goods to escape the boundaries of property and become common. If you have an idea, sharing it with me doesn't reduce its utility to you, but in fact usually increases it. In fact, in order to realize their maximum productivity, ideas, images, and affects must be common and shared. When they're privatized, their productivity reduces dramatically. And I would add, making the common into public property, that is, subjecting it to state control or management, similarly reduces productivity. But that too is another point. So what do I mean when I say that by privatizing ideas, images, and affects, that it reduces their productivity? I mean, this is a common thing in the open source internet discussions, which is that the productivity of cybernetic production, of uses of the internet, etc., require the openness of knowledges. Openness to information. And similarly true, you could say, in scientific production. Scientific production works, the production of scientific knowledge works through the common access to the results of previous production. And how does that happen? It happens through conferences, through journals, etc. If you keep private an idea, it ceases to be productive. That's what I'm trying to say. I would make a similar argument about affects and emotions. I mean, you can of course produce affects on command, and you do. Like, you produce friendship on the job, but it's a radically different and reduced thing from your production of affects outside of relations of property. I'm trying to say. Okay. In this sense, if this were true, if you accept what I'm saying so far, property is becoming a fetter on the capitalist mode of production. Here is emerging a contradiction internal to capital. The more the common is corralled as property, the more its productivity is reduced. And yet the expansion of the common undermines the relations of property in a fundamental and general way. One could say in rather broad terms that neoliberalism has been defined by the battle of private property, not only against public property, the way it's usually thought of, neoliberalism's privatization of public property, like privatization of public goods, transportation, etc., public industries, but also, and maybe more importantly, the battle of private property against the common defines neoliberalism. Here it's useful to distinguish between two types of the common, both of which are object of neoliberal strategies of capital. And And this could serve as a kind of belated initial introduction to what I mean by the common, which I haven't really explained yet. So I mean by it at least two separate things. On the one hand, the common names the earth and all the resources associated with it, the land, the forest, the water, the air, the minerals, and so forth. This is closely related to the 17th century English usage of the commons with an S. On the other hand, the common also refers, and this is what I've been talking about so far, to the results of human labor and creativity, such as ideas, language, affects, and so forth. We might think of the former as the natural common and the latter as the artificial common, but such divisions between natural and artificial quickly break down in this context. In any case, my point in this part is that neoliberalism is aimed to privatize both these forms of the common. So on the one hand then, with this first notion of the common, one major scene of such privatization has been the extractive industries, providing access to transnational corporations for instance, diamonds in Sierra Leone, or oil in Uganda, or lithium deposits and water rights in Bolivia. Such neoliberal privatization of the common, here in terms of that, what I was calling the natural common, has been described by many authors. I'm thinking here of explicitly of David Harvey and Naomi Klein, who describe this in terms of that mark a renewed importance of primitive accumulation, or what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, dispossession of those natural resources, oil in Uganda, like something like that. Okay. But I'm more interested in the other side of it, the neoliberal strategies for the privatization of what I was calling the artificial common, which I think are much more complex and contradictory. Here the conflict between property and the common is fully at play. The more the common is subject to property relations, as I said, the less productive it is, and yet capitalist valorization processes require private accumulation. In many domains, capitalist strategies for privatizing the common through mechanisms such as patents and copyrights continue, often with difficulty, despite the contradictions. Think of, for instance, the music industry and the computer industry. They're full of examples of the ways that private property through patents and copyrights continues despite those difficulties. What I mean by the difficulties, the difficulties of controlling the reproducibility of ideas, of music, of code, of images. They function nonetheless to harness them. This is also the case with so-called biopiracy. That is, the processes whereby transnational corporations expropriate the common in the form of indigenous knowledges or genetic information from plants, animals, and humans, usually through the use of patents. Biopiracy, if you're not familiar with this term, it's used often in Brazil for precisely about transnational corporations privatizing, especially knowledges and plants and animal information in the Amazon. That's partly the thing. So traditional knowledges such as the use of a ground seed as a natural pesticide, for example, by Monsanto, or the healing qualities of a plant are made into private property by the corporation that patents the knowledge. Parenthetically, I would insist that piracy is a misnomer for such activities. Pirates have a much more noble vocation. Pirates steal property. These corporations instead steal the common and transform it into property. In general, though, capital accomplishes the expropriation of the common not through privatization per se, but in the form of rent. So now I'm coming back to that point. Several contemporary economists, especially French and Italian ones who work on what they call cognitive capitalism, which I said earlier, argue that just as in an earlier period there was a tendential movement from rent to profit as the dominant mode of capitalist expropriation, today there's a reverse movement from profit to rent. Patents and copyrights, for example, generate rent in the sense that they guarantee an income based on the ownership of material or immaterial property. This argument doesn't imply a return to the past. In other words, the income generated from a patent, for instance, is very different from that generated from land ownership. The core inside of the analysis of the emerging dominance of rent over profit, I think, and this seems to me rather significant, is that capital remains generally external to the processes of the production of the common. Whereas in the case of industrial capital and its generation of profits, the capitalist plays a role internal to the production process, like I was saying before, particularly in designing the means of cooperation and imposing the modes of discipline. In the production of the common, the capitalist must remain relatively external. Every intervention of the capitalist in the processes of production of the common, just as every time the common is made property, reduces productivity. So rent is a mechanism to cope with this conflict between capital and the common. A limited autonomy is granted the processes of production of the common with respect to the sharing of resources and the determination of the modes of cooperation, and capital is still able to exert control and expropriation of value via rent. Exploitation in this context takes the form of the expropriation of the common. This discussion of rent points on the one hand to the neoliberal processes of accumulation of dispossession insofar as primitive accumulation can be called a form of absolute rent, like I said before. I hope that term makes sense. In any case, it's the other side that interests me more. On the other hand, this discussion casts a new light on the contemporary predominance of finance, which is characterized by complex and very abstract varieties of relative rent. That's the way I would understand how finance functions as a form of rent. If, for instance, a Swiss-Italian economist, Christian Marazzi cautioned us against conceiving of finance as fictional in opposition to the real economy, a conception that misunderstands the extent to which finance and production are both increasingly dominated by immaterial forms of property. In other words, what he's trying to argue against is these, I think, rather common notions that came up very strongly during this advent of the financial crisis last fall, which was a criticism of finance as fictional forms of value, in contrast to the real economy, which is material and concrete in that sense. And so what Christian Marazzi is pointing out is, in fact,